Okay, I'm going to change, I'm sorry that I haven't been here particularly for the Mexico ones this morning, you know, not only because of your work, but Mexico City was one of the places that we did work in, and so it would have helped me to contextualize, so maybe you can help me as I raise some of these issues, do this. I also, first of all, Teresa, I'm very happy that you're here. This is really what your inaugural symposium for the work that you'll be doing, and I think everybody's very excited that that you are here and that the conversations will be deepened, right? Not that they're not deep already, they will continue to be deepened. I'm going to change the tone maybe a little bit because I think our last presentation kind of left us a little bit like, okay. No. It just, for us living in Chicago, made us like think, you know, things aren't that bad here. Okay? And I'm not sure that that's one of your intended consequences. But I think that this is a project that, as Teresa said, I'm a co-author. We have two other colleagues that worked with this. I've started, I had one big project that I did on unaccompanied Cuban minors, and there kind of figured out that the movement of minors, at least during the Cold War, had a lot to do with kind of these big state policies, and had to do with our framing of children and childhood in the context of rational projects and competitions between two versions of the same rational project. And then I was left with the question, well, what in this new era, okay, if we can call it a post-Cold War, is it, you know, postmodern or whatever it is that we tag it? Well, how do young people see themselves? Do they see themselves as agents of change? Do they see themselves as actors, right, in their own lives? And I want to start, this is not about romanticizing young people. We wanted to study actively engaged. I would dare say that some of the sociological studies done is many young people, probably most, are apathetic, like most citizens. And so therefore this was a very intentional work in terms of reaching out to those who were leaders, who were engaged, because we do, I think, know a lot about your average, whatever that is, with all the problematics of average, but that we know more about those who are generally out there than those who are engaged. And so this was this idea. I wanted it to be interdisciplinarity as sort of a strategic, very strategic part of the work. Just because, again, I come from a program that is interdisciplinary. It is a program that brings humanities and others. So I was at Chapin Hall for a year, which was wonderful because they just let me do my work, and that always helps, right? To be able to think and talk to other people. So the team included Irene Ricini, who is from Rio. She is the director of CSP. Anybody here from Brazil? Okay, we had another conference, there's lots of people from Brazil. CSP, she's a sociologist, actually studied at the University of Chicago. I like to say there's the Chicago boys and the Chicago girls, and the Chicago girls are actually doing really good things in Latin America. And Norma del Rio, who is from Mexico City, she leads up a research center at WAM. And so she's a psychologist, and then I'm a political scientist. So at the end of my brief synopsis here of the work, I'd like to try to think a little bit more like an urban planner and bring space back into it. And again, I'm going to ask you to help me. First is, who were these young people? What we basically did was reach out to organizations that not just work with young people, but that are really set up to empower, and oftentimes are run by young people, okay? We were looking at a younger range, and most of the community organizers were, 23, 24. In my book, that's young, okay? And so there were young people that were basically identified by the directors. I want to say Cristina Correa is here. She is a graduate student in our program, and maybe she will weigh in as well. When I met her, she was 17, working with Chicago young authors, and had a lot of very beautiful things to say that were included in the book. So how we did this was we kind of came together with a series of themes, okay, that we, pulled from our kind of interdisciplinary backgrounds, trying to understand the narratives of young people, and it was then applied in 3 different cities. We chose cities, obviously, because that's where the majority of youth in the world lived, that's where we lived, and felt that it was an important public arena in which activism sometimes resonates a little bit more than in other arenas. And so that was the idea of choosing these 3 cities. And then part of it is also coincidence, right? I mean, a lot of our research, it's, collaborations that are set in place. Some of it is somebody introduces you to somebody, and I think that wonderful, if you will, just very subjective part of how we come to research is one that we don't give ourselves enough time to enjoy, okay? Rio, Mexico City, and Chicago. Okay, so Brazil, Mexico, and the United States, but it's really Rio, Mexico City, and Chicago. The other part of, so we ended up with about 20 or 25, between 20 and 25 young people in each one of these 3 cities. We interviewed them in sort of these open-ended interviews. We then asked them to write their own personal narratives about their trajectories and what they were involved in and what their values were. In each one of the 3 cities, the young people came together and they actually put out a publication that was then shared amongst their peers. And then we sort of took that and the interviews and tried to make some sense of it. I should say also that as we were coming to our sample, we had some very interesting debates and discussions about what is a young person, okay? I was sort of working with a group of under 18, and Irene, my colleague in Rio, comes back with somebody who's 29, and I'm like, oh, that is old, okay? This does not fit into the definition here. And of course, these are very flexible because these are not only socially constructed, but they're also economically constructed, and the UN does have a certain set definition that includes whether or not you're living at home with your parents, okay? As part of it, if you are a young adult or you're in transition to or whatever. So that was, one of the debates. We also debated a lot, modernity, post-modernity, etc. Forms of engagement, what we were looking for. At the end there, we decided it could be any activity aimed at trying to make a change that impacted your life, okay? That had a public component to it, all right? So it wasn't just, fighting with your sister, but it was, something that was, that had a public component to it. Through the interviews, and I'll just summarize these very quickly, but we ended up really thinking the trajectories in 3 phases. One was unbecoming. How did you become engaged, okay? And secondly is how you were engaging, okay? What kinds of things were you involved in? How were you doing it? How were this kind of stuff? And then envisioning. You could tell a little bit here, there's the psychologist, the sociologist, and the political science at play in terms of the kinds of questions that we ended up sort of pulling together. We expected there to be differences. I mean, these are 3 very different cities. The spatial configuration, particularly in Mexico City, is vastly different, not only quantitatively, but just qualitatively. But we found a lot of similarities. I'd like to talk about that before I go to the differences. One is that almost everybody, I think there was exception was one in all these 3 cities, that all of these young people actually shared one thing in common, and that was early on in life they had somebody who gave them permission to think, okay? Not to get involved in politics, not to, be an activist and a rebel rouser. In fact, in many, particularly in Mexico City and Chicago, parents are like, do not get involved in that, okay? Especially if you're undocumented or somebody in your family is. But there were just sets of circumstances in all these families that did lead to that. Now, you tell a psychologist that and it makes a lot of sense, but you tell a political scientist that and, we just haven't been there in terms of that literature. So finding that for us was important. As young people grow older, there are other intervening factors. Peers makes a huge difference. And community organizations aimed at empowering, and again, there is a definition the UN uses in terms of whether or not these organizations really are empowering or not, so we kind of followed that criteria, but these organizations make a huge difference in creating safe zones. Schools across these 3 cities became places where young people feel they lose their rights, okay? That they are, instead of, this is not John Dewey's model here, or Paulo Freire's model of schools. These are schools that students feel that they lose their, so when we look at the schools as an influence, that's not what is occurring. There may be a teacher there, okay, who actually opens the door, makes the linkages, but schools, at least high schools, are not places of empowerment, okay? There's, for instance, Mikva Challenge is one of the organizations that I worked with. They get students involved in electoral politics. They'll have one teacher that they work with. That teacher usually is the debate coach or something. That person becomes very important in somebody's life. But as an institution, the school is not that. What they're engaging in, and these are young people, mostly, not exclusively, working class, in communities, of working class communities. Most of them have a very sort of democratic agenda, I would say, very modernist. I mean, it's about, equal opportunities, bettering their schools. Obviously schools, if schools are what disempowers you, schools become very high up on the list. It's also the place that's the promise, the place of skills, et cetera, et cetera. The issues kind of drop down, and that's where there's a lot of differences, obviously, between the 3 cities at the time. Violence was very prevalent in all 3, but much more in Rio and in Mexico City than in Chicago, okay? Again, not surprising, even those of us who look at the statistics here in Chicago, that violence was one of the things that young people in these other 2 cities were engaged in. They shared this concern that young people were portrayed negatively in media and talked about in derogatory terms, and that they felt that disempowered them, okay? Because, if all the images are that young people are, whatever, either apathetic or violent or, doing all sorts of things, then for those who are trying to actually make a mark on society, they find that to be a great obstacle. So the concern about trying to reconstruct different images and deploying youth, okay, their youthfulness as a surprise element in terms of actually getting people's attention, okay? One of the interviews, a young man said, they expect me not to be able to speak clearly or, without, kind of neighborhood accents. And when I get up and I'm very articulate and I can, make references to all sorts of, legal documents and Supreme Court decisions, et cetera, they take note. And he says, that's the moment where I've got them. Okay, so it was really deploying and using these opportunities. In many cases, they all felt discrimination in one way or another. Again, the ways discrimination's felt in Brazil is different than here. It is discrimination, but these moments become places and for them to turn it around, at least for these leaders, as a way to kind of battle their sense of what is marginalizing them. The forms of engagement, again, are all over the place. Electoral politics, there were people involved here because it was during, start dating, I'm talking academics, so it's okay, this happened a long time ago. when Barack Obama was actually running for the Senate. So you had young people, and there was the emerging movement in Rio around the workers' parties, and so electoral politics there. Mexico, nobody wanted to touch electoral politics. But that was the minority, even in those two cities. Forms of engagement are, you know, from media clubs to, you know, neighborhood organizations to organizations that are finding young people's voice, you know, writing as a tool of empowerment. And so there's a range of forms of engagement that go outside the traditional areas. And again, for those who study youth politics, in most countries the voting age is 18. I think Rio is 16. You can vote. You don't have to vote at 16. So if you want to understand engagement, you kind of have to go outside the electoral arena anyways. Okay, so that's sort of not surprising. I'll leave places of engagement actually towards the end, but in terms of the way that they envision their own politics, there is, you know, and this is held up by surveys, actually global surveys as well, there's a more tolerant generation. There is a generation that is, I mean, we wouldn't know it in the United States if you looked at our political arena, but then the average age, I think, of Congress is, what, 40, somebody help me out here, no political scientist here. It's like around late 40s, okay, or 50s, something like that. So that's, but younger people have, I mean, tolerance is a very important, they're very interested in informing themselves, in having facts, in listening to other people's and understanding that there is there may be other opinions, all right? And again, back to this idea of youth as a negative image, for many of them, it's very important to actually arm themselves with information and with facts, because it combats that image that youth are flippant or youth are, you know, even if it's a Twitter account, okay? But that there is a need to have, you know, information about this. Their sense of, the one thing that we did find that, I mean, it sort of becomes the overarching theme of the book, is that unlike all the discourses around young people in Teresa, we heard that like 2 days ago, you know, in all these, you know, universities and mayors and everybody, you know, youth is the future and invest in the future and children are the future or whatever. They're saying, we don't want to be the future, okay? We want you to take us as we are today. I mean, I think that that's a very interesting switch, because that's the temporality, I would say, and we can debate this, but that's more temporality, not of modernity, but of post-modernity, okay? So in kind of looking at, you know, if there's a wrap-up at that level, is that there is an agenda which is modest, okay? This isn't about changing the world. It's not the utopic 60s. It's not, you know, it's a very modest agenda, which basically says we want equal opportunities and we want a chance to be able to, you know, make a mark on the world, okay? Our mark, not our mark, but, you know, and that, but it's something that they are very cognizant that if they are constructed in the future, their rights are not necessarily given to them today. So that temporality, I think, is something that that does suggest, if you will, another sense of placement within the context of political discourses that that at least shifts a bit that modernist discourse of the future, or the rational discourse. Some of the differences clearly are when it comes to rights. Okay, rights in the United States are constructed as individual rights, and there are civil rights, but they're pretty, you know, it's about freedom of speech, it's about freedom for me to be educated. Brazil has for many years had a very extensive campaign around children and youth rights. They actually, thanks to my colleague who was one of the architects and promoters of bringing the UN Bill of Rights to national law. They've actually codified this into national law. That is not to suggest that children in Rio are better off than children here in the United States, but that at least the discourses of rights are different and that there is an understanding of that. I think in Mexico there is also the social agenda is one that is much more part of political discourses than it is here in the United States, and so as such that's there. They identify themselves very differently, okay? I think national identities are very weak, except Mexico, okay? Go figure, all right, that's, it's still there very strong, even though many young people in our group were thinking about leaving, okay? So that's, some had taken steps to start moving in that direction, but national identity was still very strong. Cities' identity, I mean, they did, los Cariocas identify themselves as such, but it's more the neighborhood, okay? There is, I think, a sense that it's their communities, okay? Their communities, and their communities can be multiple communities. It's youth community, youth defined as a, social, political category, and community as a neighborhood community, geographically, racially and ethnically codified, class codified as well, but that's a sense of place that is very keen. Okay, so the nation's not the place, the city's not even the place, and back to your idea here of the disassembled city, there is, I think the city's experienced in different ways, right? It is not all experienced as, this is my city. Even here in Chicago, okay, with all the, I would say, sports structures, newspapers, thinking about Anderson's work, imagine, communities and important to the print press, we have the 2 newspapers, so maybe we're disassembled anyways, okay, because we have 2 major newspapers, but there is, it is the neighborhood, and it is the community that becomes the point. So even in these huge global cities, okay, well, actually we're not Sao Paulo, but in these big global cities, the neighborhood becomes a very important place. It is not, globalization is experienced, again, in a very small scale. Not that they're not aware of, okay, the global implications of neoliberalism, of wars. I mean, there is, I think the global informs the local, but it does not drive the local, at least for working class youth, okay? I mean, it may be different for children who end up in privileged schools, who don't have to fight for the basic kinds of services either for their communities or in their schools because they already have them, and then they can give themselves the luxury of kind of jumping into these solidarity movements. But they're not unaware of, okay, the global implications. And their ideas of government, I think too, government for them, and I mean, I'd be interested to find out, I mean, from in other cities where there's these big crises, there is a sense that government, despite what is the new normal, that government should provide a safety net for those who need it. I mean, that there's almost like an ethical, understanding of the role of government in terms of that. So the part I think here that I'd love to kind of think through a little bit more, we were, Teresa and I had got to hear Saskia Sassen 2 days ago, and Saskia's sort of throwing around a new idea, and they're always interesting to kind of follow, and I've been thinking a little bit about this, and I'm sure I'm not going to articulate it exactly how she meant it, okay? So help me out. But in part that, one of the things that global cities have not really done is taken advantage of all the knowledges that we have in cities. And that she is trying to think through how it is that the marginal, however that is defined, can really contribute the kinds of knowledges that they have about the city in terms of providing, identifying problems as well as providing solutions. So I think in a certain sense, I would say that this may have been an exercise in this. It's very hard to do work with young people because you do have to go through the IRB. I was at DePaul at the time. I had to fight with them because they told me I had to not mention their names, okay? And I wanted to be able to give young people the choice, okay, whether they wanted to be footnoted or not in terms of their names. And so that became a real struggle because IRB protects everything except your intellectual property of your young, Okay, so something that we protect, IRB does not protect for young people. So that, so again, bringing in the voices of young people into the academy, I think maybe it's one of the ways that we can, think about, sort of these global voices. There are multiples. I mean, she talked about the homeless and the rats and the homeless and the, the flooding and this and that and the other, and who knows first when a flood's coming, somebody's living on the streets, right? And so I think that may be one of the, again, how we actually do research in that way. The comparative stuff is always tricky, obviously. This in part we were able to do. I think there was a lot of trust and a lot of just goodwill with 3 researchers, and so we had a good time doing it, and there was a sense that we spent a lot of time getting to know each other, getting to know the cities, spending time in each other's cities, spending time with with the different organizations that we were all working with, and then still understanding that there were differences and ways, things that we could never understand, okay? Because, some things you just can't ever understand. So this, I'd like to maybe end there. I don't know if I need to speak anymore.
No, this is great.
Okay.
This is a great setup now for some conversation as we do structuring. So this is wonderful. And usually what we've done is we've given the discussants a chance to make some comments first, and then we sort of open it up. So, Patricia, I don't know if you had any, I don't want to put you on the spot.
But she didn't.
Okay. Okay, let's go ahead and anybody who has a comment on it, go ahead.
I was wondering that these young people that you work with, they were like engaged in a kind of movement, because like in Santiago, in Chile, in Colombia, last year and the previous year was like a strong student movement that they were like trying to take down the reform for the education law. But this was more like engagement in daily life, or it's a
It's a mixture, right? These were not, the pivotal moments were the 2006 election here, Barack Obama, the rise of Lula in Rio, in Mexico, it was the end of the PRI, okay? That seems so long ago, all right. So there were pivotal national moments, but these were not moments of great student activism. We do have colleagues who are now actually doing the same work in Bogotá, and in Santiago, and in Buenos Aires. And the next conference is about, looking at what's happened, and are there, is there something unique about this particular moment that, that we could learn from. And I think the conference, this is done under the rubric of International Child Watch. The conference is basically going to be state policies that are hostile to families and young people, and responses to that. Whether it's the cuts in education, whether it's the deportations in the United States, whether it's the, ignoring large sectors of communities in Mexico City. So, yeah.
Yes, thank you. That was a wonderful talk. I just had a couple questions. Related to Mexico City, what were the specific youth that you worked with in terms of what were their neighborhoods? If you could expand on the context of their neighborhoods. Then the other one is just, I know it wasn't quite germane to your study because, or I'm just curious, the youth that you work with, that they identified. I'm just wondering if they had any perceptions or what were their attitudes or understanding about youth incarceration.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if that ever came up in terms of wondering what are the different perceptions of youth incarceration in the United States and Chicago as opposed to Brazil, and I'm just wondering if that
I think that, let me start with that question, because the second one I'm not going to be able to answer, okay, fully. But the first one is, it did come up here. I mean, it was down in the juxtaposition of why spend money on jails and not in schools, okay? That was the way that they saw it. And at the time, there weren't like these massive deportation rates, but there were concerns that there could be, okay? So I would put that under incarceration as well. In terms of the neighborhoods in Mexico City, I'm going to refer you to the chapter on Mexico, which was written by my co-author. But the organizations ranged from, there is one that is tied to the United Nations, for instance. There was one organization that worked with the rights of disabled young people. There was one that was doing media projects. There was another one that was involved in some of the school, trying to find a voice in the schools that was outside the student organizations, because the student organizations are run by political parties in Mexico, so there were groups trying to, kind of find that. So again, a little all over the place, but, and it was, there wasn't one particular neighborhood, there were several neighborhoods that were involved in that, and I think the one thing that I didn't mention is that, and this is remember 2006 to 2008, it really is pre the boom of technology and social media, okay? It was there, but not quite there. Mexico, the young people in Mexico were using social media much more extensively and more deeply than in Rio and in Chicago. The ones in Chicago, really far behind, okay? And I think some of that has actually been, the distribution where social media and computers are in Chicago has been documented, so.
Patricia, and then Arish.
I was really interested in sort of, we were talking about these differences in terms of how the Colonists conceptualized rights, and I was interested in that difference in the U.S. sort of model of rights was pretty clear. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that difference with Brazil and Mexico. And then the counterpart to that question has to do sort of with a little bit more on the background of the Colonists in terms of, I'm wondering, are they migrants? Like I'm thinking about your talk and sort of yours as a context of these massive population shifts. It doesn't have to be international, but living rural to see. And so I'm curious then about the title of your talk. So the title of your talk, I think, has the word citizenship in it.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious about how you all were thinking about that, given that they have different conceptualizations of rights, and also you said that they don't necessarily identify nationally, so it just sort of opens up these categories in very interesting ways, and I'd love to hear more about that.
I mean, citizens to me is an active person, so I think that's the way we're using it. We're not using it as a legal construct, but rather as un ciudadano, right? In the sense of versus, I may say, in Cuba, for instance, I have a colleague who's a philosopher who says, I want to be called a ciudadano, not compañero, okay? That there is, it is in that concept that certain rights are embedded in that, so it's from there that we move with the idea of citizen. In terms of the group here in Chicago, there was an overwhelming number of Latinos. I mean, again, part of that happened because demographically that's where the schools were in the organizations, but in part it's just, the range, okay? And many of them actually were, I'm trying to think, I don't break it down, but they're, most of them were from immigrant families, but they themselves born here, okay? And the sense of rights, I mean, people learn this in the United States very quickly. My right to speech, freedom of speech, I mean, that becomes, maybe it is that it is also in the context of trying to find an effective voice, not just a voice, but a voice that can have an impact, that First Amendment becomes very important, right? And so, we don't, in Rio there's billboards, okay, el derecho de los ciudadanos, de los niños y de los jóvenes, and that, I mean, youth have been raised with that, there is a bill of rights for children and youth, and there's councils that promote it, there's brochures that promote it, and so they really do see themselves in that way, okay, that they're, as a group, they have certain rights. That doesn't exist in the United States, it just doesn't, that's not the construct. And Mexico has a deeper, I think, social issues agenda than the United States does. So, I don't know, it's void of the history. The history here is very much about civil liberties and civil rights, but particularly individual rights. You know, and as well, one little thing about that, but that's, I mean, apart from the youth, I mean, I remember this is just in terms of rights and how we conceive them, but Gorbachev's speech at the United Nations many years ago where he said, you know, the French Revolution gave us individual rights, the Bolshevik gave us group rights, and sort of the challenge here is how you put these two things together, you know.
So, I know that you're trying to research young people in general terms, but because all young people are not created equal, how did you take that into account? Like, my experience as a South Asian or Asian person, as a young person in Chicago, is very different than a Black or Latino or first immigrant versus second immigrant versus white. So I think when Mary Emanuel talks about youth being the future, I think he's talking about a very particular race, maybe a particular class base. That's his particular youth of future. I don't feel like I count in that youth. Did your youth that you researched on feel like they're all young people? Or how did you divvy that up with class and race?
Yeah. No, they're personal narratives, okay? And so to start with, they're individual stories, okay? So they dealt with their ways of thinking about that, right? There is, I think, there's a couple of things. In terms of identities, everybody understands that there's differences, okay? I mean, I think that's sort of an assumption here that the experiences are going to be different. There are experiences of racism and discrimination. There are experiences of feeling marginalized, okay? Like I said, most of the young people came from community-based organizations that are in working class neighborhoods. Not that everybody participating in those are, okay? But I think that there is a class bias in this sample, okay? That tends towards more working class young people. Now, what they do, I mean, and again, that is a shared kind of perspective, which is that, you know, I can be immigrant, or my parents are immigrants, I can be Mexican sometimes, I can be Latino other times, I can even say I'm American when I travel abroad, but at the end of the day, I'm also young. So young becomes an overarching that is a politicized, for the deployment in these particular struggles, not in all their struggles, but in these particular struggles, youth becomes a deployed category that allows for them to reach out to other people. And they see it as such. I mean, even Latino youth, okay, there's one really interesting interview with a young woman in Cicero who basically says, when somebody asks me what I am, I'm very proud to say I'm Mexican. But it also makes me feel like when I say Latina, I can bring in more people into my organization. Okay, so that's a strategic kind of choice that's there. And I think it's the same thing as youth. So does that answer your question? Or,
yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I'll start there.
Okay, you'll start there. Okay. Andy.
Hey, thanks for this. It sounds like good, really interesting research. I wanted to hear a little bit more about the trajectories of becoming. You talked some about the obstacles that people face with the schools and stuff like that, and also the fact that there were individuals who had encouraged them to think, or at least give them the freedom to think, right? What are some of the other kind of places where people found possibilities and that, entrance into movements and activism? So, and then the other question is, I wanted to hear a little bit more potentially about how the youth understand the system against, that they're up against. To get a sense of their understanding of what they're up against, and especially whether there's any links or connections between the ways that they, in the different cities, if they're understanding links and connections between their own struggles and the struggles of other youth in the Americas.
Yeah, I think, okay, on the first one, their peers are very important, okay? Hey, I'm going to this meeting, okay? That becomes, so peers are very, influential in introducing young people to the possibilities of an organization. And then in these cases, again, these are community-based youth organizations. These are not political parties. These are not, although they're all engaged in different kinds of social and political advocacy, they're not necessarily political organizations. Those organizations are safe safe places, okay, for them to be able to, they learn skills there, they learn, you know, whether it's Southwest Youth Collaborative, there are a million things that people learn there. They learn how to put together a survey, okay? Just even gathering information as to, you know, what the counselor, counting how many counselors were in different schools. So community-based organizations, I think, are the place of training, okay, and creating safe space. There is already, at least according to their own personal narratives, there is already an inclination to get involved, okay? And that inclination is one that is, at least, again, in their memories, okay, Cristina's here, so she can maybe talk about it. In their own memories, it is about having had the permission to be able to ask questions, to be able to, you know, kind of articulate things, to be able to, you know, sort of a sense of self that, you know, if somebody, you know, it's almost, I mean, this is, if in the home you have a certain respect, okay, even if it's a very basic respect from your parents, when somebody disrespects you, you're gonna think that there's something wrong with that, okay? So there's, you know, almost like a, you know, there is that as well. There's a bunch of other things, you know. There were those moments of discrimination that many youth felt, you know, when they saw their family kicked out of a house because they couldn't pay the rent, okay? Or when they saw, you know, a guy in a wheelchair being kicked around, or, you know, something that does, you know, jar, if you will, that kind of expectation. So that's more that situational thing that links them with wanting to do something. And where was the second part of you?
About how they understand the forces that they're up against.
Oh, you know, I don't think that there is, I mean, again, these are not kind of political or ideological, you know, organizations where you sit and you read and you have the, you know, look at the structure of power, and, you know, these aren't Saul Alinsky organizations, right? So I don't think that came through a lot. They understood what the consequences of things were, okay? Of what, for instance, the negative images of young people in the media and what that did to them. Did they understand what that conglomerate media, Murdoch, you know, on and on is? I don't know, okay? It didn't come through in the interviews. But the consequences of them not having a voice in there and being able to have the power to construct their own image is something that they did understand. So.
You mentioned the UN rights, statement of rights of youth. What were some of those elements of that statement, and how did they relate to what you saw in other cities other than Rio?
Other cities other than what?
Other than Rio? Since,
okay.
You mentioned that was where it was at least relatively high profile.
Yeah.
That people were aware of it because of the federal legislation. But
yeah.
In Mexico City or Chicago, was there an awareness of that was existed, or what it meant?
The United States is the only country that has not signed on to the Bill of Rights at the UN.
What were some components of it that were?
Yeah, no, I mean, so it's not even part of the discourse here, okay? I mean, it is the only country, because they say the spanking lobby or whatever. I mean, they call it the you know, parents want to be able to hit their children, okay? So some of the components of it that are, it's about being able, that children have the right to have a voice in decisions that affect their lives, okay? That, I think, is a very, you know, kind of integrated. We could think about that particular right as a First Amendment right, okay? That there's almost wanting, I mean, all the First Amendment is about just being able to say whatever you want to say, but, you know, free of government persecution. But I don't think that particular charter is incorporated in the consciousness of young people in the United States. I think in Mexico there is, one of the things that's been very strong, or at least during that particular time, had to do with indigenous rights, okay? And that is a UN, although that's not necessarily tied to the Children's Bill of Rights. There is more of a, I guess, an appreciation that there's entities outside your own country that actually talk about rights, that provide rights, that, you know, we have influence on the parameters of rights even within your own country. I think the United States is completely oblivious to that. And I think, you know, not only young people, but I think everybody, you know, we don't start a sentence talking about, you know, educational rights saying embedded in the UN Charter of Children's Bill of Rights, you know, or that's not where we start here.
You mentioned a little bit about the role of the parents in either encouraging or discouraging participation. And I'm wondering, particularly in working class, you know, families or youth, like what motivates these youth to get involved in terms of if it is the parents, or sometimes in working class neighborhoods and families there's not this inherent human capital and social capital that's necessarily tied to power structures, existing power structures. And so it's like, where is the push and the motivation behind these kids coming from?
The parents here, and it's not just parents, sometimes it's an adult, okay, just an adult. It could be an uncle, it could be a friend, it's not always a parent. And it's not that, at least in this group, okay, and again, this is a very biased and not, you know, I mean, it's very constructed sample, but I think that it's not necessarily that parents are encouraging the young people to get involved in politics, quite the opposite, okay? There is stay out of that, all right? I mean, you know, why are you gonna do that? I mean, there is a sense that politicians are corrupt, that political activism is somehow, what they articulate is that they felt that they were valued in the home, that their ideas were valued, not that their activism was necessarily valued. And that's a difference, I think, that one leads to, if you will, almost a sense of self that they can. So again, back to this, oftentimes there were situations that either their communities or a friend or they themselves had felt some form of discrimination or being slighted because of who they were, because they were young, because they were black, because they were immigrant, because they were women, I mean, young girls, I mean, other, you know, things that came in, but those other things kind of intersected with their age, and that is what, in a certain sense, brings forth, if you will, the desire to change whatever created that situation. Is that